Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered why, after faithfully tithing for years, the heavens still feel silent? Why the promised windows of blessing seem shuttered tight, while others who give nothing seem to flourish? What if the issue isn't your faithfulness, but our understanding? What if tithing was never meant to be a heavenly transaction, but something far deeper, something the church, perhaps unintentionally, forgot to tell you? Today we're not just opening our Bibles, we're turning over the stones we've walked on for too long and rediscovering the sacred rhythm behind true biblical giving. The essence of tithing, if one dares to explore its marrow, is not arithmetic but allegiance. It is not simply the act of giving a portion, it is the relinquishing of control. In a world ruled by margins and forecasts, where every coin is calculated for maximum efficiency, the tithe stands as a curious rebellion. It is the soul's declaration that what we have is not truly ours and what we offer is not truly lost. To tithe rightly is to trust deeply. One does not wait until the barn is full to share grain with a neighbor. He offers the seed before the season reveals whether the harvest will be kind. Imagine the early Israelite, recently freed from slavery, wandering in a wilderness where bread falls from the sky and water springs from rocks. This people had no bank accounts, no savings, no pension plans. Their very survival was wrapped in daily dependence. And still, they were commanded to give the first of their fruits, the best of their livestock, the earliest of their increase. All were to be set apart, not after their needs were met, not once comfort was secured, but before, first. That is the rhythm God established: faith first, fruit later. This logic, if it may be called logic at all, runs contrary to the wisdom of the world. The world says, secure your future and then give what you can spare. But God, the divine author whose ways make a mockery of human wisdom, asks for what we fear to lose, not what we can afford to part with. Tithing, then, is not mere giving. It is surrender. It is the cheerful tremble of the hand that offers not from excess, but from essence. Consider the story of the widow of Zarephath, who prepared a final meal for herself and her son from a handful of flour and a trickle of oil. She had planned to eat and then die. But when the prophet Elijah asked her to feed him first, she obeyed not because she understood, but because she trusted. And in that moment she became rich, not in possessions, but in provision. The jar did not empty. The oil did not run dry. Her offering was not a payment, it was a proclamation that her life was not governed by scarcity, but by a God who multiplies what is offered in faith. In truth, many today treat tithing like a sacred insurance policy. Give your 10% and expect a tenfold return. They do not say it in so many words, of course, but the sentiment hangs in the air like perfume in a crowded room. Give, and God owes you. Yet this kind of giving is not giving at all. It is bargaining. It is a subtle attempt to domesticate the divine, to turn heaven into a transactional system where faith is replaced by formula. But God is not a machine into which we insert coins of obedience to receive blessings on demand. He is not mocked, nor manipulated. True tithing has always been about the heart, about who reigns there, and what we believe about the unseen. A tithe given with clenched teeth and a calculator is not the tithe of Abraham, who gave Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils out of gratitude and awe, not requirement. Nor is it the tithe of the poor farmer who brings his first basket of figs to the temple, not knowing if blight or locusts will spare the rest of his grove. It is not the tithe of faith, but of fear. And perfect love, we are told, casts out fear. One must understand that God has never needed our wealth. The cattle on 1,000 hills are his already. He does not ask for a tenth because he is short on funds. He asks because he desires fellowship with his people, fellowship that is rooted in trust. When we give first, before the budget is balanced, before the future is clear, before the math makes sense, we are saying with our hands what our lips often hesitate to admit, that he is enough, that he provides. that we are not owners but stewards. It is a paradox, one of those divine paradoxes that fill the pages of Scripture like golden threads woven into a tapestry of seeming contradiction. To give is to gain. To lose is to live. To empty the hand is to fill the heart. And so the tithe becomes more than a spiritual practice. It becomes a spiritual posture, a way of living open-handed in a tight-fisted world. A way of breathing trust in a culture that holds its breath in fear. A way of saying, not just with word or thought, but with every coin and check and offering plate, that our treasure does not rest in vaults or balances or banks, but in the unseen hands of the God who has never failed. Among the strangest truths whispered through the pages of Scripture is this: the God who crafted the stars does not weigh offerings on scales. In a world that counts everything, minutes, money, influence, and worth, this is bewildering news. We are taught from childhood that bigger is better, that more is superior, that value lies in quantity. But then we encounter a moment in the temple, quiet and almost invisible, where a poor widow, clothed not in riches but in reverence, drops 2 tiny coins into the offering box. Clink, clink. And heaven roars. Not because the treasury swelled that day, but because her heart did. This is not how we are trained to think. We are trained to look at the numbers, to gauge our worth by our output, to give, not only generously but impressively. There is a subtle danger in the way giving is often taught, even in the warm halls of churches. The widow is mentioned, yes, but then the budget sheet returns, and the emphasis shifts once more to goals and targets. The hand is encouraged, but the heart is often bypassed. And yet the story God tells is precisely the opposite. He is far less interested in what is given than in what remains. Not how much left the hand, but how much stayed behind. There is a holiness in small offerings given with pure hearts that cannot be replicated by grand donations wrapped in pride. The widow's 2 mites were not worth much in any human economy. They couldn't purchase bread, much less a temple pillar. But they purchased something more precious still, the pleasure of God. It is almost scandalous to say, but true nonetheless, God can be pleased by something that would be scoffed at by men. This alone should cause us to tremble, for it reveals a divine economy entirely out of step with our own, one in which the heart is the coin, and the motive is the measurement. The mistake, of course, is in thinking that generosity is a performance, that God is sitting in the crowd, applauding our applause, moved by the flourish of our acts. But God does not observe from the outside in. He sees the soul first. Where men see amounts, He sees intentions. Where we measure portions, He measures sacrifice. The tithe given without gratitude is like a symphony played without tuning, technically complete, but spiritually dissonant. The act may be performed, but the melody does not reach heaven. It is tempting, especially for those with abundance, to believe that giving more always equates to pleasing God more. But the Scriptures unravel this illusion. The rich gave large sums that day in the temple, and yet Jesus did not commend them, not because they gave falsely, but because they gave safely. Their giving did not cost them comfort. It did not disturb their security. It did not alter their sense of control. But the widow's gift, a whisper of metal on stone, spoke volumes. It said, "I trust you even if this leaves me hungry. I trust you even if no one notices." And God noticed. This truth pierces through pride. It reminds every giver, rich or poor, that they stand on level ground before the altar. For God is not impressed by zeros. He is not persuaded by applause. He is moved by love, love that gives without needing recognition, love that does not calculate, love that says, "Here is what I have, Lord. Take it. It's yours already." The tithe is not merely an act of financial discipline, it is a revelation of inner loyalty. And where loyalty flows from love, even the smallest offering becomes a thunderous act of worship. We forget, in our tidy categories, that God does not separate giving from living. He sees them both as one. How we give reveals how we live. A heart that gives out of fear gives cautiously. A heart that gives out of duty gives grudgingly, but a heart that gives out of joy, out of devotion, out of simple, unshaken trust, that heart is precious in His sight, because that heart resembles His own. He gave us His Son, not because He was forced to, but because love compelled Him. So when we give in kind, we echo eternity. There is no number large enough to impress the God who made galaxies, but there is sincerity deep enough to move Him. The true tithe, then, is measured not in currency but in courage, not in calculation but in compassion. And this is where many are never taught to look not at the amount given, but at the faith required to give it. There, in that hidden arithmetic of the soul, God finds what He seeks. It is a curious thing how institutions often inherit the shell of a truth while leaving behind its soul. Tithing, in its earliest conception, was not a ritual aimed at maintaining religious architecture or the elegance of ceremonial life. It was an act of justice, an act of mercy, a covenantal rhythm designed not merely to support priesthood, but to preserve the dignity of the poor. And yet, through time and repetition, the living breath of this practice has often been confined to budgets and balance sheets, as though God were an accountant in the sky rather than a father of orphans and a defender of widows. In Deuteronomy, the tithe was not simply collected and stored, it was distributed and shared. Every third year the people were commanded to set aside a portion of their produce, and bring it not to a central sanctuary alone, but to the gates of their towns, that the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows might come and eat and be satisfied. This was not charity. It was covenant. It was God embedding justice into the economic rhythm of His people. The tithe, in that sense, was not about fundraising, it was about remembering. Remembering who they were. Remembering what He had done. Remembering those who were often forgotten. To tithe faithfully was to see the invisible. To bring one's harvest to the town square and say to the fatherless child, "You belong." To offer provision to the widow and say, "You are not abandoned." To welcome the sojourner and whisper with one's actions, "You are seen." This is no cold transaction, it is warm theology with hands and feet. And it is here, perhaps, that modern practice has drifted furthest from its roots. For while buildings are built and programs funded, the cry of the lonely still echoes, and too often the offering plate passes by without ever touching the lives of those it was meant to reach. One must understand, the tithe was never meant to stop at the altar. It was meant to flow from it. The altar was the place of meeting, but not the final destination. It was the table from which the bread was broken and carried into the streets. It was from the presence of God the provision poured not into storehouses alone, but into homes and hearts and hungry bellies. And when we reduce the tithe to the upkeep of religious performance, we risk turning holy fire into smoke and mirrors. There is no doubt that the temple, the church, the sanctuary, whatever name we assign to the place of worship, requires support. But when that support becomes the end instead of the means, we have missed it. The tabernacle of God was never a monument to His glory alone, but a conduit of His compassion. He does not dwell in temples made with human hands, unless those temples become gateways of grace. The tithe was not meant to polish the golden lampstand while the poor sit in darkness. Perhaps the heart of God beats most loudly in this forgotten rhythm, that giving is not merely upward but outward. The Levitical priest may have offered sacrifices, but his portion came from the shared generosity of the people, and in return he too was to be generous. The tithe did not create a spiritual hierarchy, but a spiritual ecosystem, where everyone played a part and no one was left behind. The moment it becomes a system to preserve power rather than extend mercy, it ceases to reflect the kingdom it was meant to model. One can imagine the danger of forgetting this. Imagine the traveler arriving at a town, weary and worn, finding the temple ornate and splendid, but the people cold and hungry. The tithe, faithfully collected, faithfully counted, and yet not faithfully spent. The hypocrisy of beauty inside and brokenness outside is not new. The prophets railed against it. Isaiah thundered that God took no pleasure in burnt offerings when justice was ignored. Amos declared that music and feasts were offensive to God when the poor were oppressed. The tithe, if hoarded within the sanctuary, becomes a dam instead of a river. If the first fruits are holy, then so too must be the hands that receive them. And if the offering is brought in remembrance of what God has done, then it must also reflect what God is still doing, feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, defending the helpless. When a community tithes rightly, the effects ripple far beyond the temple walls. The tithe becomes a quiet miracle, a loaf of bread on a doorstep, a blanket in winter, a hand held in grief. It is theology made visible, truth wrapped in flesh, love counted not in sermons but in shared meals and lifted burdens. And so the purpose of the tithe was never to impress the heavens with structured devotion, but to align the earth with divine compassion. Its value was not in what it built, but in whom it blessed. The tithe was never just about the worship of God in song, it was about the worship of God through service, through sacrifice, through the steady refusal to let anyone in the community be forgotten. There is a dangerous comfort in formulas. They offer predictability, a sort of mechanical certainty in a world that otherwise dances to invisible rhythms. The human heart longs for something stable, something that can be mastered, controlled, and replicated. And so, even with something as sacred as tithing, we are tempted to turn it into a machine. Insert 10%, pull the lever of faith, and wait for the blessings to pour out like coins from a divine slot. This vision is appealing, but it is not the vision of Scripture. God is not a formula. He is a Father. And where formulas reward performance, a Father responds to love. The idea that tithing is a guaranteed investment strategy, give to get, sow to reap, pay to prosper, may find echoes in popular sermons, but it finds no foundation in the heart of the gospel. It replaces relationship with transaction, faith with calculation. It treats God as though he were bound by our generosity, compelled to act simply because we did our part. But God cannot be manipulated by our obedience, however sincere. He cannot be coerced by our giving, however sacrificial. For he does not bless according to the formula. He blesses according to his will, his timing, and above all, his knowledge of what our hearts truly need. There are those who tithe with the unspoken expectation that blessings will follow immediately, tangibly, visibly. When they do not, they question either the promise or the provider. But what if the true blessing of obedience is not always financial or material? What if it is the peace that surpasses understanding, the resilience forged in trial, the quiet companionship of the Spirit in the midst of lack? These are blessings too, though the world does not put a price tag on them. And they are given not because we mastered a formula, but because we stepped out in obedience, no matter the result. The life of Abraham offers a piercing example. He gave not a tithe from abundance, but a son upon an altar. There was no guarantee, no clause, no covenant loophole. Only a command, give me your son. And Abraham obeyed, not because he saw the outcome, but because he trusted the one who gave the command. It was obedience, raw and staggering, that moved the heart of God. The ram in the thicket did not appear because Abraham performed a ritual. It appeared because he walked in faith, trusting the character of God over the certainty of reward. To walk in obedience is to risk not recklessly but reverently. It is to step into the unknown with a heart anchored not in outcomes, but in the person who called you. The formula asks, what will I get if I give? But obedience asks, what has God already given that I might respond? There is no transaction here. There is transformation. When obedience is rooted in love rather than leverage, it reshapes the soul. It softens pride. It burns away selfishness. It aligns the heart with the rhythm of heaven. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the prosperity formula is not that it asks too much of God, but that it asks too little. It reduces his infinite wisdom to a cosmic vending machine, his blessings to cash and comfort. But God's greatest gifts are often disguised in suffering, in silence, in seasons of waiting. And these cannot be bought, only received. The widow who gives her last coin may not receive a fortune. She may still go home to an empty cupboard. But she walks with a God who notices her offering, whose gaze lingers on her devotion, whose presence meets her in her lack. That is blessing beyond reckoning. There are those who will say, "But doesn't God promise to bless the tithe?" Yes, he does, but blessing is not always visible to human eyes. Sometimes it comes in withheld disasters, unseen mercies, or quiet provisions that arrive just in time. Sometimes it is the shaping of character, the strengthening of faith, the nearness of God in the valley. And all of this comes not because the equation was solved correctly, but because the heart bent low in obedience and said, "Thy will be done." In the end, God does not reward those who tithe perfectly, but those who trust completely. The tithe is not a spiritual ATM. It is a doorway to dependence, an invitation to walk with the God who sees in secret and rewards in his way, in his time. To obey is to let go of guarantees and hold fast to grace. For in the kingdom of God, it is not the formula that moves his hand, but the faith that opens ours. There is a great confusion that has quietly crept into the theology of giving, a subtle distortion that repositions the heart of the tithe. It is the notion that if one gives, then one will receive, as if generosity were the price tag on divine favor. This belief, though often wrapped in religious language, is not far from superstition. It treats God as one who must be persuaded or paid off, as if his blessings are reluctant and require unlocking through precise acts of devotion. But in truth, the tithe was never a bribe. It was a response, a trembling, joyful echo of gratitude to a God who had already given everything. When Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, there was no law commanding it. There was no heavenly threat or institutional system requiring a percentage. There was only a man, battle-worn and victorious, recognizing that all he had gained had come from a source far higher than his own strength. Abraham had just been blessed by a priest of the Most High God. Bread and wine had been offered. A word of benediction had been spoken over him. And in return, without coercion or command, he gave a tenth. Not to earn a blessing, but because he had already been blessed. The tithe was not a purchase. It was praise. That is the original rhythm. God gives first. He creates, he sustains. He rescues, he redeems. And then the people, overwhelmed and humbled by his goodness, respond. Always God first. Always grace first. From the manna in the wilderness to the deliverance from Egypt to the daily provisions of rain and harvest, Israel was taught that their lives were built on a foundation of unearned kindness. The tithe was woven into their calendar and culture, not as a burden, but as a remembrance. Every 10th animal, every 10th bushel, every 10th coin, it was all a way of saying, we did not make ourselves. We are not our own providers. All we have is from you. But gratitude, real gratitude, is difficult to maintain when fear creeps in. And fear always seeks control. That is when the tithe begins to shift from a gift into a gamble. The moment we start giving in order to get, we have lost the plot. What was once an expression of worship becomes a contract. What was once an open-handed offering becomes a nervous negotiation. If I give this, the heart wonders, will God protect me? Will he prosper me? Will he heal me? The question is no longer about love, but leverage. The error is subtle but severe, because what it ultimately suggests is that God's goodness can be bought, that he must be coaxed into kindness. But such thinking forgets the most essential truth. God loved us while we were still sinners. He gave long before we gave. He blesses because he is good, not because we are generous. The sun rises on the just and the unjust alike. Rain falls on the fields of the righteous and the wicked. The heartbeat in your chest, the breath in your lungs, the smile of a child, the quiet mercy of a second chance, none of these come because you tithed. They come because he is kind. To give in response to blessing is to see the world rightly. It is to recognize that we live surrounded by gifts, many of which we forget to notice. It is to say with trembling joy, "What could I possibly give you, Lord, that you have not already given me first?" The tithe becomes not a tax, but a testimony. Not a payment, but a poem. It is not about making God move. It is about acknowledging that He already has. This is why the tithe, when rightly understood, softens the soul. It kills entitlement. It rebukes pride. It rewrites the story that says, "I earned this," and replaces it with one that says, "I received this." It turns the eye upward, not inward. And in that upward gaze, something shifts. Giving is no longer painful or obligatory. It becomes joy. It becomes gratitude wrapped in action. It becomes a quiet dance between a father and his child, where the child, holding something small and insufficient, offers it anyway because love is not measured by amount, but by affection. When giving is seen this way, no one must beg or manipulate. There is no need for emotional appeals or spiritual guilt trips. The heart that sees clearly will give freely, and the tithe, once distorted into a tool of fear or ambition, returns to its rightful place, a response of awe to the one who gives without measure. To understand the tithe in the light of Jesus is to see with new eyes. It is to realize that He did not come to abolish the law, nor merely to uphold it, but to fulfill it, to complete it, to embody it, and to raise it from external observance into living breath. And so with the tithe. The question is not whether Jesus demanded it, but whether He redefined it in the radiant light of love. For He did not simply repeat the old commandments. He took them into His hands and unfolded their deepest meaning, pressing them not onto tablets of stone, but into the chambers of the heart. The tithe, as written in the law, was exact, calculated, defined by weight and measure. But when Jesus stood watching the treasury in the temple, He did not praise those who gave from surplus. He noticed the widow with her 2 copper coins, a gift so small it could hardly pay for the oil in a lamp. Yet He declared her offering greater than all, for she gave not a tenth, but her all. What law was she fulfilling? Not the Mosaic regulation, but the very heart of God's desire, a giving not rooted in percentage, but in devotion. Jesus rarely spoke of tithing in prescriptive terms. When He did, it was not to affirm the practice as a sufficient badge of righteousness, but to expose the hypocrisy of those who tithed mint, dill, and cumin, yet neglected justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They had mastered the law in form but missed its music. They had kept the letter but lost the tune. The tithe was never meant to be an end in itself. It was a training ground for the heart, a rehearsal for generosity, a discipline of remembering. And Jesus, in fulfilling the law, did not destroy this foundation, but revealed the structure it was always meant to support. In Him, giving is no longer about arithmetic. It is about overflow. It is not that 10% is now irrelevant, but that it is no longer the ceiling, it is the floor. Under grace, the question is not how much must I give, but how much dare I keep. The spirit of the tithe is no longer measured in tenths and tokens, but in surrendered hearts and selfless hands. This is why the early church, filled with the Spirit, sold property and possessions to meet the needs of the community. They were not tithing in the old way. They were embodying the new way, giving not by calculation but by compassion. Jesus did not tithe His blood. He gave all. He did not tithe His time or affection. He poured Himself out, even unto death, and in doing so He became both the giver and the gift. This is the fulfillment of the tithe, not merely in paying the priest, but in becoming the offering. For what the law required in portions, grace transforms into a lifestyle. The tithe was once a portion set aside. Now the disciple becomes the portion, wholly offered to God. This fulfillment does not mean the old was evil. It means it was preparatory, like a shadow that points to the shape of a coming figure. The tithe trained the heart to release. Grace completes the training by asking for everything, not because God is greedy, but because He is generous. He asks for our all because He gave His all. And in this exchange we find life, not loss. It is tempting in a world obsessed with balance and fairness to retreat to the simplicity of fixed giving. It feels safe, predictable. But the Spirit that Jesus gave does not abide in safe places. It moves like wind, unpredictable and powerful. It leads us not merely to tithing, but to giving when it hurts, when it's inconvenient, when it defies logic. The Spirit fulfilled in Christ compels us to go beyond the tithe, not in a spirit of legalism, but in a spirit of worship. The tithe, in the light of Jesus, is not erased but transfigured. It is no longer a law to obey, but a life to imitate. And his life is one of self-giving love. He does not call us to measure generosity, but to live in it. For when the Spirit fills a heart, the hand opens wide, not because it must, because it cannot help itself. Oh, then we return not with heavier burdens, but with clearer eyes. The tithe was never meant to be a spiritual toll or a divine tax. It was a reflection of the heart's posture toward a generous God. Its purpose was not to fill buildings, but to fill lives. It was not a formula to manipulate heaven, but a faithful echo of gratitude for blessings already received. And above all, it was fulfilled, not erased, in the person of Jesus Christ, who gave not a portion, but himself. We are not invited to tithe out of fear, nor to give as if we're making a bargain with God. We are called to become a people of generosity, not because we must, but because we have been so deeply loved. The secret was never in the percentage. It was in the posture. A heart that gives in response to grace will always give beyond the law. Let us not settle for the shadow when the light has come. Let us give not just our coins, but our compassion, not just our tithe, but our trust. For in doing so, we become not merely givers of offerings, but living offerings ourselves. And that truly is the highest worship.